Before the world knew her as a duchess wrapped in royal protocol, before she became the face of best-selling memoirs and multi-million-dollar Netflix deals, Meghan Markle was simply a determined actress fighting for relevance in Los Angeles. No royal titles, no castles, no global headlines hanging on her every word. Just Meghan, an ambitious young woman with a relentless work ethic, a smile that could light up any casting office, and, if you believe the people who knew her, a knack for shaping herself into exactly what the moment required. It's easy to forget that long before Buckingham Palace, there was Hollywood Boulevard. Long before the hand-wringing over royal press releases, there were the grim realities of bit parts, unpaid auditions, and call sheets that never quite materialized. In those early days, Meghan's life was all about the hustle. She waited tables, took on background roles, and did whatever it took to get noticed in an industry that chews people up faster than any British tabloid ever could. But at the center of that lesser-known version of her life stood a man most people have barely heard of, Trevor Engelson. Not a palace aide or an aristocratic heir, just a Hollywood producer who knew Meghan before any of this. A man who watched her transformation up close and, depending on who you ask, became the first casualty of her unstoppable climb. Their story begins around 2004, in the kind of place aspiring actors and producers always seem to find each other. A crowded, unremarkable bar somewhere in West Hollywood. By every account, they clicked right away. Trevor was already building a reputation in the film industry, known for having a good eye and a generous streak when it came to helping up-and-coming talent. Meghan was in her early 20s, trying to scrape together enough credits to land serious auditions. What started as casual dates quickly grew into something more. Friends remember them as inseparable, two creative souls chasing the same dream, leaning on each other when the city felt too big and too brutal. For nearly 7 years, they were a team. They shared apartments, swapped career advice, and propped each other up when the doors slammed shut. In 2011, after years of dating, they married in Jamaica. It was, by all accounts, an intimate, laid-back ceremony. No paparazzi, no elaborate contracts, just vows, close friends, and a couple who seemed to have finally found their footing. But that's where the fairy tale stopped. Almost as soon as Meghan's career began to heat up, the cracks began to show. First, it was just the small things. Trevor would fly to Toronto to visit her on the set of Suits, only to find her distracted or exhausted. He'd send care packages and handwritten notes. Meghan would thank him politely but never seemed fully present. It wasn't a spectacular implosion. No affair, no explosive arguments, just a growing distance that no amount of loyalty could seem to close. People who were close to Trevor say he was head over heels, the kind of partner who believed that true love meant sticking it out no matter what. He was all in. And Meghan? Well, she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, focused on her work, her next move, her next version of herself. When the end finally came, it wasn't a tearful conversation over the phone or a late-night confession. It was a package. Inside was her wedding ring, neatly tucked away with no note, no explanation, no warning. Just a silent full stop on everything they'd built together. If you talk to people who knew Trevor back then, they'll tell you the same thing. He wasn't just heartbroken. He was bewildered. He'd spent years believing in their future, making sacrifices so Meghan could thrive. He wasn't some casual fling she ghosted. He was her husband, the man she'd told her deepest truths to, or at least the truths she'd chosen to share. And one of those truths would become the most haunting. According to Trevor's closest friends, Meghan had once confided in him that she couldn't have biological children. It wasn't a passing comment or an offhand remark. It was, as he understood it, a defining part of their marriage. They planned their life around that reality. Trevor, being in love, accepted it without hesitation. He didn't question her sincerity. He didn't demand second opinions. He simply believed her. Years later, watching Meghan announce her pregnancies to the world, with all the glowing magazine spreads and royal photo ops, he felt something crack inside him. Not because she'd moved on, not because she was happy, but because he realized that the most important thing she'd ever told him might not have been true at all. He didn't rush to the media with accusations. He didn't write a tell-all book or sit for an exclusive interview. Instead, he carried that sense of betrayal quietly, confiding only in a handful of trusted people. And while Meghan's image was polished to perfection, smiling beside Harry, embracing motherhood, championing causes, Trevor was left wondering whether he'd ever really known the woman he married. It's easy to see why this story is so unsettling. forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can someone be both genuine and strategic? Can a person be sincere in one moment and calculating in the next? If you listen to Trevor's account, and the hushed admissions of others who knew Meghan during those years, the answer isn't simple. Because here's the thing. Meghan has always been remarkably adaptable. People who worked with her before she met Harry describe her as warm, relatable, and laser-focused on her goals. She could charm a casting director in a 5-minute meeting. She could rally a set crew with a single pep talk. And if you were part of her plan, you felt like the most important person in the world. But when the plan shifted, so did her attention. For Trevor, that adaptability felt like betrayal. One minute, she was the woman who cried over rejection and questioned whether she was good enough. The next, she was slipping effortlessly into circles of influence. First Hollywood elites, then eventually British royalty. It was like watching someone hit a switch and become a new person overnight. And what stung the most wasn't the end of their marriage. It was realizing that maybe he'd only ever known one version of Meghan, the version she needed him to see until it no longer served her. While Trevor was nursing the wounds of their breakup, Meghan's ascent continued without pause. She finished her run on Suits, launched a lifestyle blog, and began speaking publicly about gender equality. By the time she met Prince Harry, she was already an expert at managing her image. When the news of their relationship broke, the world couldn't get enough. The American actress and the British prince. It was a modern fairy tale, a narrative so perfect it practically wrote itself. But behind the headlines, there was a pattern that some couldn't ignore. Every step of Meghan's journey seemed meticulously curated. Every setback became an opportunity to pivot. Every relationship that no longer fit her evolving brand quietly faded away. It's worth pausing here to consider something important. Ambition isn't a crime. Reinvention isn't inherently dishonest. People grow. People change. But when every reinvention leaves someone hurt or bewildered, eventually the questions start to pile up. One former colleague described Meghan as always 5 steps ahead. Another said she was the best listener you'd ever meet, until she didn't need you anymore. Those aren't accusations of evil. They're observations of a person who knew how to survive in an industry that rarely forgives weakness. When Meghan and Harry sat down for that infamous Oprah interview, millions watched her recount the struggles she faced inside the royal family. She spoke about suicidal thoughts, about racism, about feeling unprotected. It was raw, emotional, and, for many, profoundly relatable. But for those who knew her in a different era, it raised another question. Was this another reinvention, another carefully calibrated version of Meghan Markle? Trevor, for his part, remained largely silent. He didn't contradict her. He didn't offer any clarifications. But those who'd heard his story knew the truth was more complicated than any one interview could reveal. It's easy to dismiss all this as the bitter ramblings of an ex. But Trevor had nothing to gain from sharing his experience. He was already successful. He didn't need fame or money. In fact, when he toyed with the idea of a TV show inspired by his story, a comedy about an ex-wife who marries a prince, he quietly shelved it, perhaps realizing that no amount of fictionalization could make the real story any less painful. And so, for years, he stayed quiet. He watched from afar as Meghan transformed into a global icon. He watched the documentaries, the podcasts, the photo spreads, and he kept his own memories tucked away, like old letters you can't quite bring yourself to throw out. Until recently, that's when whispers started to circulate. Maybe it was the result of mounting public skepticism. Maybe it was just the natural consequence of too many narratives colliding. But suddenly, Trevor's version of events wasn't just a private confession anymore. It was a crack in the polished surface of Meghan's image. And that's where the real intrigue lies. Because if Trevor's account holds even a grain of truth, it forces us to look at Meghan Markle differently. Not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a person who has always known how to play the long game, even if it meant leaving people behind. You can call that strategy, you can call it survival, but you can't call it accidental, because nothing about Meghan's rise has ever been accidental. And perhaps that's why this story resonates so deeply. It's not just about one marriage that ended badly. It's about how carefully constructed narratives can collide with inconvenient memories. It's about how the truth doesn't always scream from the tabloids. Sometimes it whispers from the mouths of people who loved us most. When those whispers finally surface, they don't just challenge the public's perception. They challenge the person at the center of the story to look in the mirror and ask, "Who am I really?" And that, more than any headline or royal scandal, is the question that lingers long after the cameras stop rolling. For Meghan, reinvention was never just a hobby. It was survival. Those who watched her climb from unpaid gigs to the world's most photographed woman say she possessed a kind of discipline most people can't imagine. Every interview, every handshake, every charity project, it was all part of a blueprint she carried in her head long before anyone else could see it taking shape. That's what made her so compelling and, to some, so unsettling. People who once worked alongside her remember that she had a way of studying people, almost like she was mapping their expectations and then mirroring them back. One former assistant described how Meghan could step into any room and become precisely the version of herself that person needed. To a casting director, she was humble and grateful. To a producer, she was confident and ambitious. To a young woman asking for advice, she was warm and reassuring. And it never felt forced. That was the genius of it. She was convincing because she believed it herself in the moment. If you asked Trevor what he thought about that adaptability, he'd probably tell you it was both her greatest gift and the thing that ultimately destroyed their marriage. He never doubted that she cared for him, but he came to suspect that what she cared about even more was the story she was writing for herself. And he just didn't have a place in the next chapter. Years later, when Meghan was celebrated on glossy magazine covers and praised as a modern feminist icon, Trevor couldn't help but feel a strange dissonance. This was the same woman who had once cried in his arms about feeling overlooked and underestimated. Now she was the embodiment of confidence, all while he was left wondering whether any of their shared past had been real. That's what makes this story so different from the tabloid chatter. It's not about petty jealousy or fame-hungry revenge. It's about the quiet heartbreak of realizing the person you thought you knew better than anyone was always, in some way, auditioning, always rehearsing for the bigger role just around the corner. There's another piece people rarely talk about: the ripple effect this left on Trevor's own life. Friends say he withdrew for a while, not because he wanted pity, but because he needed time to understand what had happened. He questioned his own instincts. Was he naive? Was he too trusting? When someone you love tells you something as serious as "I can't have children," and you build your life around that, you don't expect to one day watch them cradle a newborn on global television. And while it's true that medical circumstances can change, and Meghan's defenders are quick to point that out, what lingered for Trevor wasn't just confusion. It was a deeper ache, the sense that he'd been used as a stepping stone, a temporary chapter in a much grander story she was writing. Meanwhile, Meghan's public transformation was so thorough, so seamless, that it left little room for questions. She stepped onto the global stage looking unshakable, polished, and prepared to take on an institution centuries older than any Hollywood studio. She spoke about empathy, about giving people the benefit of the doubt. But behind closed doors, insiders say she was furious when whispers of her past began to resurface. It wasn't just about protecting her privacy. It was about protecting a narrative she'd spent years perfecting. Those closest to her say she felt betrayed not by Trevor himself, who never publicly trashed her, but by the idea that her old life refused to stay buried. She'd worked too hard to control her image to let someone else rewrite it now. If you look at the timeline, the irony is almost poetic. Just as Meghan and Harry were signing production deals and launching their brand of progressive royalty, Trevor's quiet story started to gain traction. It wasn't an orchestrated attack. It was simply the inevitable consequence of leaving too many unanswered questions in your wake. And that's the lesson that echoes through this saga. The past doesn't vanish because you choose not to acknowledge it. Past waits, sometimes for years. And when it reappears, it doesn't always arrive with fanfare or scandal. Sometimes it just shows up as a single recollection, a detail that doesn't fit, a memory that challenges the official story. People often say the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully you bury it. In Meghan's case, the truth isn't necessarily that she was cruel or scheming. It's that she was determined. And determination, when left unchecked, can look a lot like ruthlessness. So when you see the glamorous photos, the perfectly worded statements, the multi-million-dollar documentaries, remember this. Behind every reinvention is someone who remembers who you were before the transformation. Someone who knew you without the filters, without the publicist-approved soundbites. And sometimes that person holds the missing piece of the puzzle. For Trevor, speaking his truth wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming his own story. 'Cause no matter how carefully Meghan curated hers, he had lived through a version no one else could erase. And in the end, no amount of rebranding can change what really happened between two people when no one was watching. And maybe that's why this story resonates so uncomfortably with so many people. Forces us to look beyond the glossy headlines and PR-crafted statements and wonder how much of any public persona is ever completely authentic. 'Cause if someone can reinvent themselves so flawlessly that even those closest to them are left questioning what was real, it makes you realize just how fragile perception can be. Even now, Trevor isn't shouting from rooftops or begging for attention. He's not posting cryptic messages or issuing ultimatums. He's simply living with the quiet knowledge that his truth doesn't fit neatly into the narrative Meghan built. And while the world debates whether she was a victim or a strategist, he remains the one person who has seen both sides and paid the price for believing in one version over the other. And that's what makes this saga more than just celebrity gossip. It's a study in how ambition can blur the line between authenticity and performance. It's about how a single decision, like mailing a wedding ring back without a word, can echo for years, leaving questions that may never be answered. Because no matter how many Netflix episodes air or how many polished interviews are broadcast, the past doesn't simply vanish on command. It sits there, patient and quiet, until the moment it's finally acknowledged. And when it is, it has a way of making everyone look a little closer at the stories they've been sold. In the end, maybe the question isn't whether Meghan Markle was ever truly sincere. Maybe the question is simpler and far more universal. Can any of us ever fully escape the person we once were, or the people who remember? And for all the chatter about Meghan's so-called calculated moves, it's worth remembering that every person who reinvents themselves does so for a reason. Sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's ambition, sometimes it's just the desperate hope to outrun the parts of your story that feel too small, too painful, or too ordinary. Maybe Meghan wasn't trying to hurt Trevor at all. Maybe she was simply running toward the version of herself she always believed she could become, no matter the collateral damage. But for Trevor, that distinction hardly mattered. Because when you're the one left behind, still holding on to shared dreams that suddenly feel meaningless, the why doesn't soothe the hurt, doesn't erase the confusion of wondering if your relationship was ever built on something solid, or just the illusion of permanence that vanished the moment it became inconvenient. Even now, years later, the contrast is striking. Meghan stands at the center of global conversations about modern royalty, feminism, and identity. Her every move is dissected and defended, criticized and celebrated. And Trevor? He remains the quiet counterpoint to her legend, the footnote she never intended to be part of the story. But sometimes footnotes are where the most revealing truths live. That's what makes this narrative so compelling and so uncomfortable, because it doesn't offer a simple villain or a flawless heroine. Gives us two people whose lives collided, intertwined, and then split apart in ways that neither fully understood. And in the aftermath, each of them carried a version of events that would never completely reconcile with the others. Maybe that's why this story won't fade away, no matter how many carefully crafted statements try to bury it. Because at its core, it's not about royalty or fame. It's about something everyone can recognize. The ache of realizing that sometimes the person you loved most was always writing an ending you didn't see coming.